what I'd like to talk about is what David Schwartz of West Memory wrote for this week's Parshas Vayakhel. Every week since he was killed fighting for Am Yisrael, we've been discussing what he wrote. So this week he actually put together Vayakhel Pekude. He wrote it as one. So we'll read what he had to write, even though this week for here in America, we're just doing Vayakhel. So he says, Parshat HaShavua, our portion this week, is involved with, in its main aspect, with those matters that relate to the building of the Mishkan. Basically, the specific commands from the earlier portions of Truma now are come to be realized in our Parsha, and the construction happens in our Parsha. He says, practically speaking, these portions, which most years are read together, are a repetition with some minor modifications on the earlier portions of what is said in Truma Tetzaveh. But on the side of the construction of the Mishkan, and this is what we spoke about on Monday, the Torah also teaches us the need to observe Shabbos and to rest on Shabbos. More precisely, at the beginning of Parashas Vayakhel, and even before the Torah gets involved in the construction of the Mishkan in our portion this week, it teaches us about the prohibition of doing work on Shabbos, and specifically the prohibition of making a fire on Shabbos. This proximity between Shabbos and this proximity between the obligation to rest on Shabbos and also doing work in the Mishkan brought Chazal to teach us and to say that we derive what is prohibited on Shabbos from the construction of the Mishkan. And this we discussed on Monday. This was explained in Tractate Shabbos 70a. Now, we need to say as an introduction that the prohibition of working on Shabbos the idea that the prohibition of Shabbos comes before the command to build the Mishkan, and for sure, Kav Chomer, we already know that this passage of Shabbos was commanded in the Ten Commandments in Parashas Yisrael. So it raises the question: what's the connection? So the main commentaries, Rashi, Nachmanides, so they explain that the fact that the Shabbos introduces the Mishkan was established in order to teach us that the building of the Mishkan does not override Shabbos. As a general rule, when we're investigating a specific topic, we need to explain we need to go into depth to understand the commandment and what exactly is the Torah commanding us. So he says, let's look closely at these verses. What is the verse that it says here at the beginning of Parshas Vayakhel? It says, 6 days you shall work, and on the seventh day will be for you holiness, a Shabbos, Shabboson, a day of rest for Hashem. Whoever does work shall die. The Talmud mentions a known dispute between Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Yishmael with respect to the concept of whether or not it's possible to combine Torah study with the need to live in the world and make a livelihood. And the Talmud says, it says in the verse, this comes from Tractate Brachot 35b. It says in the verse, you shall gather in your crops. Meaning to say, you're supposed to work. You have to make a living. That's what Rabbi Shmuel says. Rabbi Shmuel says, it says, gather in your crops, v'yasafta degancha, meaning to say, you have to live. You have to make it. You have to get a job. You have to work. Whereas Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, how can a person plow during the time of plowing, and sow during the time of sowing, and harvest during the time of harvesting, and thresh during the time of threshing, and winnow during the time of the wind? Then Torah mati yalel. I have a person sitting all day being a farmer. When are they going to study Torah? So rather we say that during the time that the Jewish people do the will of God, then Bizman sheYisrael osin ritzono shel makom melachtan naasit al yedei acherim. When the Jewish people do the will of God, their work will be done by others. As it states, v'amdu zarim v'zarutzomchem, v'amdu zarim u'reutzomchem. The strangers will stand up and guard your sheep. But when Jewish people do not do the will of God, then they'll have to do their crops. Then they'll have to gather in their crops, as it states, that you gather in your crops. And not only that, but you'll have to be doing not only your work, but other people's work, as it states, and you will serve your enemies. Let me just summarize. Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai are having a dispute. On the one hand, it says in the verse, you shall gather in your crops. On the other hand, it says in the verse that you need to study Torah. So how can you do it? So Rabbi Yishmael says, gather in your crops. The person is supposed to work to make a living. Whereas Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, well, if you're working 9 to 5, when are you studying Torah? So therefore, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, no, you do your job, and then the work will be done by others on your behalf. But if you don't do Torah study, then not only will you be doing your work, you'll also be working for others. So there's a fundamental dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Should you get a job or not? Amar Abaye says, Arbei asu ka Rabbi Shmuel v'alsa biyadan. There are many people who did it like Rabbi Shmuel, that they worked and they said a verse at night, and in the morning they said a verse, a little bit of Torah at night, in the morning, and it worked. Many people tried like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and it didn't work. Meaning to say, they tried to say, I'm not going to work, I'm just going to study Torah, and it didn't work. That's the dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai in Brachos 35b. So it seems that the Gemara gets involved here and rules like Rabbi Shmuel. With this dispute between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, the Gemara does not take a compromise. And the Gemara is suggesting that these two approaches, whether we should work or study, are two opposite approaches. They're two opposite approaches. The Sfas Emes in Parashas Yisro explains the verse, 6 days you shall work, and you shall do all your work. And he explains, 6 days you shall work and do all your work. He says, he quotes, Rabbeinu Bechaya in the name of the Rambam. 6 days you shall work, serve God through doing all your work. What does it mean 6 days you shall work? 6 days you shall serve God by doing all your work. By doing all your work, that is how you are serving God. By doing all your work, that's how you're serving God. And on the seventh day, the service is without work. It means, say, for 6 days you serve God by working, and on the seventh day you serve God by not working. So, and writes David, these are words of truth. Because the days of work, are like the days of the creation. That were 6 days. So therefore, by working, we're mimicking God. So therefore, the service on Shabbos should be without work. So basically, just to pause for a moment, what David is saying, that we rule like Rabbi Shmuel, that we have to work, and quotes this Sfas Emes, that we serve God through our work. And that's why the sages say that the Torah was given on Shabbos, meaning to say, it says the Torah was specifically given to the Jewish people on Shabbos. That was the new concept that was taken with the receiving of the Torah, that the Jewish people had this incredible spiritual growth on Shabbos, and yet at the same time we say any Torah that does not have work with it is going to be nullified. And so therefore we need to take all of our work during the week and connect it to Shabbos, but Shabbos is without work. So therefore we see from here, by the way, a very powerful idea, that why was the Torah given on Shabbos? Because that was a day we didn't have to work. So that was our day for work. He says, from the Sfas Emes words, we see that specifically on Shabbos was the time for service of God, because that's where a person has the time from all the work, his freedom from the activities on the week, and that's when a person specifically has the time to study Torah. And therefore, specifically, this is how we can understand the way to fulfill the mitzvos. So, continuing, the Sfas Emes explains that the holiness of Shabbos has within it the idea that on this day alone, this day especially, we have the ability to serve God without connecting to the necessary responsibilities of everyday life. But, meaning to say, the days of the week, the regular activities, those are the days of the week. That is necessary in order for us to get to Shabbos to serve God. So basically his idea is, yes, it's an obligation to work during the week for 6 days, so that when it comes to Shabbos, we'll be able to serve Hashem with the spiritual. Now he quotes this Sfas Emes. It says, "You serve Hashem through the doing of your work. When the Torah requests from us 6 days of work, it's not a commandment for a person to go out and work, but rather it tells us how to come to a life of holiness. Our daily work is not separated from a life of holiness, but is part and parcel. The holiness of Shabbos specifically enables us, truthfully, to fulfill the service of God without any connection to the world of action." So now, we come to his last paragraph. It's a beautiful essay this week. It's just spectacular. So he says, we see from, are you doing Baruch Hashem? So we see from the words of the Sfas Emes, remember who the Sfas Emes is, the Ger Rabbi, that there's a tremendous teaching here that relates to our daily life at every moment. A person might make the mistake of thinking that his everyday life is separated, his everyday physical activity is separated from his spiritual life. But that's just the opposite of the truth. Really, and by the way, this relates back to what this is taking Rashi's approach to those mirrors. Really, our everyday life is not foreign to the eyes of the Torah, but rather it allows us to have a path to fulfill our spiritual lives. A person does not need to become separated or like a monastic away from the physical life, but like the Baal HaTurim was describing those women who gave the copper, but rather needs to connect them together with his spiritual life, to sanctify it, to bring it up to the level of service of God. This is exactly David weighing in on the side of Rashi in that debate between Rashi and the Baal HaTurim about the mirrors. And then he writes, I think that we can explain now the sin offering that the Nazir brings at the end of his day of Naziris. Who is a Nazir? A Nazir is a monastic. Nazir is a person who separates himself from funerals, from wine, from cutting his hair. So the Gemara states in Shmuel says, whoever sits and fasts is called a sinner. So he says he holds like Rebbe Lazar the Kapar. By the way, Rebbe Lazar HaKafar can also be read as Kapar, who says, what does it state? From what sin did he sin? Because he held himself back from wine. This person who only held himself back from wine is called a sinner. Somebody who holds himself back from all food, how much more so is he a sinner? So he says the sages see with this asceticism, with this monasticism, with this separation from the world, very fundamental negative approach to the world. A person needs to go far away from that approach. A person needs to actually achieve his spiritual heights specifically by taking this world and connecting it to the spiritual. And so therefore, that's what David is saying, and I'll summarize in a moment, but first he finishes with a quote from the Slonim Rebbe on Parashas Nasa. That means when a person stands, when there stands before a person the question, what is the proper path to serve God, whether it is to completely separate ourselves from this world and not to benefit at all from this world, or to engage in the pleasures of this world and elevate them to God, what is better? So we see from this that the purpose of creation, the purpose of serving God is that a Jew should engage in this world and elevate it as part of our path of serving God. It's true that the easier path is to separate completely, but the higher path is to take the physical world and bring it up to God. So to summarize what we've said so far in today's discussion is, first we started with the Baal HaTurim versus Rashi, about the mirrors that the women were donating. And Rashi says that the women, that Moshe didn't want to take these mirrors because they were used as part of the physical, they were used to entice their husbands to engage with them physically. And Moshe thought it was disgusting to take that and make that as the core of our spirituality in the temple. And Hashem said, no, this is the most precious to me, most precious of all. Whereas the Baal HaTurim said, no, that these were women who rejected the physical pleasures of the world. They threw away their mirrors because they're going to be like a monastic class of serving Hashem. So it's a fundamental approach. Is the highest path by taking the physical pleasures and bringing it to our spirituality, helping us appreciate God more, or by completely rejecting it? And that's the dispute between Rashi and the Baal HaTurim. And David on our parasha says, what's the relationship between the Shabbos and the Mishkan? Is that it says, right before we go into the spiritual, it says you have to observe Shabbos. 6 days you shall work. Meaning to say, we serve Hashem by working the 6 days so that we can come to an even higher spiritual level. That the highest spiritual level is achieved through the service of Hashem. The highest spiritual level is achieved by working in the everyday world and not by separating ourselves from the everyday world. So this is the idea of where David is really falling down very strongly onto the side of Rashi. Let me stop for a second, see if anybody has any questions, and I'll get a drink. Hold on.